The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, cutting through the silence of Sarah Mitchell's empty house like a scream. Mrs. Henderson's voice trembled on the other end. "There's something dying in the dumpster behind Miller's Hardware." Sarah's nurse instincts kicked in as she grabbed her coat, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found in the alley. A massive German shepherd lay motionless among frozen garbage bags, his powerful frame barely visible beneath a coating of ice and crawling maggots. Worms writhed through his matted fur. His eyes were frozen shut, but his chest still rose and fell in desperate, shallow breaths. "Jesus," she whispered, kneeling in the snow. Then she saw it, a faded canine collar around his neck, barely visible beneath the filth. Her heart stopped. Heroes aren't supposed to die like this, not thrown away like garbage on Christmas Eve. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell had seen enough death in 25 years as an ER trauma nurse to recognize when life was slipping away. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd learned that sometimes saving others was the only way to save yourself. Her small house in Millfield, Colorado, had been too quiet since David died 3 years ago, her 19-year-old son taken by an IED in Afghanistan. The silence had become her companion, broken only by her weekend volunteer work at the animal shelter. 6 hours earlier, Christmas Eve had felt like any other lonely December night. The worst blizzard in 20 years was burying their small military town under 3 feet of snow, and Sarah had been nursing a cup of coffee while watching old movies, trying not to think about empty stockings or the bronze star folded in her nightstand drawer. Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, nestled 30 miles outside Denver in a valley that had housed military families for generations. The town was currently divided over a heated budget debate, whether to allocate emergency funds for veteran mental health services or infrastructure repairs. The controversy had split neighbors and families, with emotions running high on both sides. Now, kneeling in the frozen alley beside this dying animal, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since David's funeral: purpose. The German shepherd's breathing was so shallow she had to lean close to detect it. His body temperature was dangerously low, and the smell of infection mixed with the metallic scent of old blood. Someone had done this deliberately. The dog's injuries were too systematic, too calculated to be accidental. "I've seen enough death to know when something's worth saving," she murmured, gently clearing ice from around his nostrils. The canine collar told a story she was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just any abandoned dog, this was a service animal, trained to protect and serve, thrown away like refuse. The parallel to her son's sacrifice wasn't lost on her. David had written about the military working dogs in his last letter home, describing them as four-legged angels who never leave anyone behind. As Sarah carefully lifted the shepherd's massive frame, his eyes flickered open for just a moment. They were brown, intelligent, and filled with a pain that went deeper than his physical wounds. In that brief glance, she saw something that made her decision final. This dog had served his country. Someone had betrayed that service in the cruelest way possible. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, that betrayal would end. Sarah Mitchell might not have been able to save her son, but she sure as hell was going to save this forgotten hero. The question was whether she was already too late. Sarah's kitchen had never served as a trauma unit, but desperate times called for improvisation. She cleared her dining table with one sweep, sending Christmas cards and unopened bills cascading to the floor. The German shepherd's body was so cold it felt like lifting a frozen statue, his limbs rigid with hypothermia. As she laid him on the table under her brightest lamp, the full extent of his condition became horrifyingly clear. His ribs showed like prison bars beneath matted, filthy fur. Maggots had made homes in several deep wounds, and the stench of infection filled the warm kitchen air. But it was the scars that made Sarah's hands shake, old burn marks, healed fractures that had never been properly set, and what looked like systematic abuse patterns she'd seen too often in her ER work. This wasn't neglect. This was torture. "What did they do to you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The dog's pulse was thready, his breathing so shallow that twice she thought he'd stopped altogether. Sarah had treated hypothermia victims before, but never anything this severe. She wrapped him in heated blankets from her dryer, checking his core temperature with a thermometer. 87 degrees, dangerously low. Normal body temperature for a dog was around 101. He was dying, and her kitchen wasn't equipped for this kind of emergency. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was 50 miles away in Denver, and the blizzard had turned the mountain roads into death traps. Sarah stared at her phone, weighing her options. Call 911? They'd never make it in time through the storm. The local vet was closed until after Christmas, and Dr. Patterson was visiting family in California. For a moment, Sarah considered the unthinkable. The humane thing might be to end his suffering right here, right now. She had access to medications from her nursing work, could make it peaceful. The thought made her physically sick, but watching him struggle for every breath was breaking her heart. Then she remembered David's last letter, the one she kept folded in her Bible. He'd written about a military working dog named Rex, who'd saved his entire squad from an ambush. "Mom, these dogs don't know the word quit," he'd written. "They fight until their last breath, not for themselves, but for us. They deserve the same dedication in return. If David died protecting others, you deserve the same chance," she said aloud, her decision crystallizing. Sarah worked quickly, starting an IV line with supplies from her home nursing kit. She administered warm saline solution to help raise his core temperature and began the dangerous process of warming him gradually. Too fast, and his heart could go into shock. Too slow, and he'd slip away before she could get him help. The drive to Denver was a nightmare of white-knuckle terror. Sarah's Honda Civic wasn't built for blizzard conditions, and visibility was near zero. She kept one hand on the wheel and the other monitoring the dog's pulse, talking to him constantly to keep herself focused and him fighting. "Come on, warrior. Stay with me. You've survived worse than this." Twice during the 40-minute journey, his breathing stopped completely. Sarah pulled over, performed CPR on a German Shepherd in the front seat of her car while snow piled against the windows, and somehow brought him back. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel, but she refused to give up. The Denver Emergency Veterinary Hospital was a beacon of light in the storm. Sarah stumbled through the automatic doors carrying 80 pounds of unconscious dog, her scrubs soaked with melted snow and blood. "I need help," she shouted to the startled night staff. "Doctor." James Crawford looked up from his paperwork, took one look at the situation, and immediately went into action. A Vietnam veteran himself, he'd seen enough trauma to recognize the signs. But as they transferred the dog to an examination table under bright surgical lights, something made him pause. "Ma'am," Dr. Crawford said, his voice filled with awe as he examined a faded tattoo inside the dog's ear. "This isn't just any dog." Sarah watched as he pulled up records on his computer, his expression growing more incredulous by the minute. The tattoo corresponded to military working dog records, and what he found made him step back from the computer screen. "Jesus Christ, Sarah," he said, reading her name from the intake form. "This dog saved my nephew at the Twin Towers." The room fell silent except for the beep of monitoring equipment. "Doctor." Crawford's hands trembled as he showed Sarah the screen. Service records for a German Shepherd named Ranger, K9 Unit 517. 23 confirmed rescues at Ground Zero on September 11th. multiple deployments to Afghanistan. Handler killed in action, 2018. "This is a national hero," Dr. Crawford whispered, "and someone tried to kill him." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The dog she'd found dying in a dumpster wasn't just any abandoned animal. He was a 9/11 hero, a warrior who'd served his country with distinction and been thrown away like garbage. The betrayal of that trust was so profound, it took her breath away. As if sensing the revelation, Ranger's eyes flickered open for a moment. They were brown, intelligent, and held a depth of sadness that Sarah recognized. She'd seen the same look in her son's eyes during his last leave, the weight of service, of loss, of carrying burdens too heavy for any soul to bear. "We're going to take care of you now," she promised, gently stroking his head. "You're safe. You're finally safe." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew the hardest battle was just beginning. Someone had systematically tortured a war hero, and she was going to find out who. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Sarah paced the waiting room like a caged animal, her nursing scrubs still stained with blood and melted snow from the rescue. Dr. Crawford emerged at dawn on Christmas morning, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, exhaustion etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "He's alive," he said, and Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "Barely. We've stabilized his core temperature and treated the immediate infections, but Sarah—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I found during surgery, this wasn't random abuse. Someone with military training did this." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Dr. Crawford led her to his office and closed the door. "The pattern of injuries, the systematic nature of the trauma. Whoever did this knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain while keeping him alive. They used military discipline techniques, but perverted them into torture. In 40 years of veterinary practice, I've never seen anything this calculated." He pulled up the X-rays on his computer screen. Sarah had seen enough trauma in the ER to understand what she was looking at. Old fractures that had healed incorrectly, burn marks in specific patterns, and evidence of prolonged starvation used as punishment. "There's more," Dr. Crawford continued. "I called my contact at the Military Working Dog Registry. Ranger was supposed to be retired to a veteran handler after his service dog died in Afghanistan. Someone named Marcus Thompson signed the adoption papers 6 months ago." "We need to call the police," Sarah said immediately. "Already did. Detective Williams is on his way." Dr. Crawford's expression darkened. "But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. When I called the registry, they told me Ranger isn't just any hero dog. He was at Ground Zero for 3 weeks straight during the rescue operations. He found survivors when human searchers had given up hope. My nephew Billy was trapped under debris for 18 hours. Ranger found him and refused to leave until the rescue team could dig him out." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. The same loyal spirit that had driven Ranger to save lives at Ground Zero had kept him fighting for survival in that frozen dumpster. Someone had taken that noble heart and tried to break it. By 8 a.m., word had begun to spread through Millfield despite the holiday. In a small military town, news traveled fast, especially news this shocking. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with calls from neighbors, friends, and strangers who'd heard about the 9/11 hero dog found dying on Christmas Eve. The story hit the local news by noon. Channel 7's Christmas Day broadcast led with grainy footage of Ranger during the Ground Zero operations, a magnificent German shepherd with alert ears and intelligent eyes, working tirelessly alongside human rescuers. The contrast to his condition when Sarah found him was heartbreaking. "A national hero reduced to this," the anchor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Police are asking anyone with information about this heinous act to come forward immediately." The community reaction was swift and fierce. By afternoon, despite the blizzard, protesters had gathered outside the police station demanding justice. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the abuse. The local VFW Post announced a reward fund that grew from $500 to $5,000 within hours. But not everyone was united in their outrage. At the emergency town council meeting called for December 26th, a bitter debate erupted that revealed the fault lines running through Millfield. "We're spending more energy on one dog than we do on homeless veterans sleeping in the streets," argued council member Robert Hayes, a Korean War veteran. "Where's this compassion when we need funding for the veteran housing project?" Sarah stood to address the packed auditorium, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "This isn't about choosing between veterans and animals, Bob. This is about honoring service, period. Ranger served alongside our sons and daughters. He saved lives at ground zero when our country was under attack. If we throw away our heroes, two-legged or four-legged, what does that say about who we are?" The applause was thunderous, but not universal. A vocal minority continued to argue that resources should go to human veterans first. The controversy revealed deeper tensions about military funding, veteran care, and community priorities that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Detective Williams, a methodical man in his 50s, began his investigation with the last known address for Marcus Thompson. What he found raised more questions than answers. The house was abandoned, with signs of a hasty departure. Neighbors reported seeing a man matching Thompson's description leaving in a pickup truck the night Ranger was found, but no one had gotten a good look at his face. "It's like he vanished into thin air," Williams told Sarah during their interview. "The strange thing is, everyone I talked to says Thompson seemed to care about the dog initially. Multiple witnesses saw him at the hardware store buying expensive dog food, toys, even a custom bed. Then something changed." Sarah had volunteered to foster Ranger during his recovery, transforming her guest bedroom into a makeshift recovery room. When she brought him home 3 days after Christmas, the proud warrior who had once charged into burning buildings was a shadow of his former self. He wouldn't make eye contact, flinched at sudden movements, and refused to eat unless Sarah sat on the floor beside his bowl. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological damage ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Dr. Crawford had warned her that the trauma might be permanent. Some dogs never recovered from systematic abuse, especially when it came from humans they'd been trained to trust. On New Year's Eve, Sarah sat beside Ranger's bed, gently brushing his coat while he slept fitfully. His legs twitched as he dreamed, and small whimpers escaped his muzzle. She wondered what horrors played out in his sleeping mind. Memories of Ground Zero mixed with more recent nightmares of betrayal and pain. "I don't know what happened to you, boy," she whispered. "But I promise you this. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." As if he could hear her even in sleep, Ranger's breathing seemed to settle slightly. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Sarah allowed herself to hope that healing might be possible. But she also made another promise, one that burned in her chest like a coal. She was going to find Marcus Thompson, and she was going to make sure he faced justice for what he'd done to this hero. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the scars of a brutal week with pristine white. But beneath the surface, in a small Colorado town and in the heart of one traumatized war dog, the real work of healing was just beginning. The question that haunted Sarah as she finally drifted off to sleep in the chair beside Ranger's bed was simple but profound. How do you rebuild trust once it's been so completely shattered? The first week of January brought a routine that neither Sarah nor Ranger had expected. Every morning, Sarah would wake to find him in the exact same position, curled in the corner of the guest room, as far from the door as possible, eyes alert despite the early hour. He never slept deeply, never allowed himself the vulnerability of true rest. 25 years of nursing had taught Sarah to recognize trauma responses, but seeing them in an animal who had once been fearless was heartbreaking in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Progress came in moments so small they might have been missed by someone less patient. The first time Ranger accepted food directly from her hand was January 3rd. Sarah had been sitting on the floor beside his untouched breakfast bowl for 20 minutes, reading aloud from David's letters home, when Ranger tentatively stretched his neck forward and took a piece of chicken from her palm. His teeth never touched her skin. Even in his broken state, his training remained impeccable. "Good boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's my brave boy." The second breakthrough came during a thunderstorm on January 5th. The rolling thunder sent Ranger into a panic attack that lasted hours, panting, pacing, scratching at the walls until his nails bled. Sarah realized the sound was triggering combat memories mixing with more recent trauma in ways that left him unable to distinguish past from present. She began playing classical music softly in his room, and gradually, the constant state of hypervigilance began to ease. Dr. Crawford visited daily, monitoring Ranger's physical recovery while documenting his psychological state. "His body is healing beautifully," he told Sarah during a Friday afternoon checkup. "But his mind, Sarah, I've seen combat dogs with PTSD before." The good news is that his training is intact. He still responds to basic commands, still has his protective instincts. The bad news is that someone systematically broke down his trust in humans. That kind of damage can be healed, Sarah finished firmly. It just takes time. But even as she spoke with confidence, doubt gnawed at her. Ranger's behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. He would stare at the front door for hours as if expecting Marcus Thompson to return. Sometimes he would whimper and paw at Sarah's hands, seeming to try to communicate something urgent that she couldn't understand. Most disturbing of all, he had episodes where he would suddenly snap to attention, staring at empty spaces as if seeing ghosts. The investigation into Marcus Thompson had hit multiple dead ends. Detective Williams discovered that the name was an alias. The real Marcus Thompson had died in a car accident in 2019. The Social Security number matched no living person. The address history was fabricated, and the truck described by witnesses had been found abandoned in a Denver parking garage with the license plates removed. "Whoever this guy is, he knows how to disappear," Williams told Sarah during one of his weekly updates. But here's what's interesting. The vet bills for Ranger's initial care after adoption were paid in cash, and they weren't cheap. Someone spent serious money on premium food, custom medical care, even specialized training equipment. This doesn't fit the pattern of typical animal abuse. Sarah had begun to suspect there was more to the story than simple cruelty. The systematic nature of Ranger's trauma suggested someone with intimate knowledge of military working dog protocols. But why would someone who clearly understood and initially cared for Ranger turn to such calculated abuse? The answer began to emerge through an unexpected source. On January 8th, Sarah received a visit from Tom and Lisa Thompson, no relation to the mysterious Marcus, along with their 8-year-old daughter, Emily. The family had been following Ranger's story in the news and wanted to discuss the possibility of adoption once he was fully recovered. Emily Rose Thompson was a small, serious child with auburn hair and intense green eyes. She had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 4 and had been largely nonverbal since her adoptive father, their first father, had died in Afghanistan when she was 6. Her adoptive parents, Tom and Lisa, had been struggling to help her process grief she couldn't articulate. "We thought maybe," Lisa began hesitantly, "maybe they could help each other heal." Sarah was initially skeptical. Ranger was unpredictable, potentially dangerous in his current state. An autistic child needed stability, not more trauma. But when Emily walked into the guest room, something extraordinary happened. Instead of approaching Ranger directly, Emily sat down on the floor about 6 feet away and began to hum, the same tune Sarah had been humming during thunderstorms. Ranger's ears pricked forward, and for the first time since his rescue, he moved voluntarily toward a human being. Emily didn't try to touch him. She simply sat, humming softly, occasionally speaking in a whisper too quiet for the adults to hear. After 20 minutes, Ranger had crept close enough that Emily could have reached out and touched him, though she didn't. "He's sad like me," Emily said suddenly, her first words during the visit. "He misses his soldier friend." The accuracy of the observation stunned everyone in the room. Somehow, this 8-year-old girl had identified what trained professionals had missed, that Ranger's trauma wasn't just about abuse, but about loss. He was grieving his dead handler as much as he was fearing his abuser. "Emily has a gift," Tom explained quietly to Sarah as they watched the unlikely pair. "She seems to understand things about people and animals that she can't always put into words. Her therapist says it's not uncommon for children on the spectrum to have heightened emotional sensitivity." Over the following days, Emily's visits became a regular part of Ranger's recovery routine. She would arrive after school, settle on the floor with her homework, and simply exist in his space without demands or expectations. Ranger began eating better when she was present, and his panic attacks became less frequent. But it was Emily's drawings that provided the most startling insight into Ranger's condition. She filled page after page with crayon sketches, a German shepherd standing beside a soldier in uniform, the same dog lying in snow, the dog cowering before a shadowy figure whose face was never clear. In every picture, Ranger's eyes held the same expression of profound sadness that Sarah had learned to recognize. "She's drawing his memories," Dr. Crawford said in amazement when Sarah showed him the artwork. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if she's processing his trauma along with her own." The most disturbing drawing came on January 12th. Emily had sketched Ranger standing protectively in front of a small figure, clearly herself, while a tall man in military fatigues stood in the background. The man's posture suggested grief rather than anger, and his face, though indistinct, seemed to be looking away in shame. "Emily?" Sarah asked gently. "Who is this man in your picture?" Emily studied her drawing with the intense concentration she brought to everything. "He's the one who hurt Ranger," she said matter-of-factly. "But he didn't want to. He's hurt too." The child's insight sent chills through Sarah. If Emily was right, then Marcus Thompson wasn't a sadistic abuser, but something more complex. Another victim, perhaps, acting out his own trauma on the dog who shared his memories of war. That night, as Sarah sat beside Ranger's sleeping form, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the case. What if the man they were hunting wasn't a monster, but another broken warrior, as damaged by service as the dog he had tortured? The thought should have made her angry. Shouldn't there be clear lines between victim and perpetrator? But Emily's drawing had planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day. Both Ranger and his abuser might be casualties of the same war, trapped in a cycle of pain that neither could break alone. As January wore on, one thing became increasingly clear. Finding Marcus Thompson was no longer just about justice. It was about understanding a truth that an 8-year-old girl seemed to grasp intuitively, that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator is drawn in sand, easily shifted by the tides of trauma and loss. The community meeting on January 15th was supposed to be about establishing a permanent fund for military working dog care, but it quickly devolved into something far more volatile. The high school gymnasium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds spilling into the hallways. Veterans sat alongside civilian families, animal rights activists mingled with law enforcement, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Sarah had brought Ranger, hoping his presence might remind people what they were actually fighting for. He lay quietly beside her chair on the stage, still thin but no longer the skeletal wreck she'd found in the dumpster. His coat had regained some of its luster, and his eyes, while still wary, held more awareness than they had in weeks. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor next to him, one small hand resting on his flank, both of them seeming to draw strength from the contact. The meeting began civilly enough, with Mayor Patricia Hendricks outlining the proposed fund and recognition program. Then Detective Williams stepped to the microphone to provide an update on the investigation, and everything changed. After 3 weeks of investigation, we've made significant progress identifying the individual known as Marcus Thompson, Williams announced. What we've discovered suggests this case is more complex than initially believed. He clicked to his first slide, a grainy surveillance photo from a hardware store showing a tall man in military fatigues purchasing dog supplies. This image was taken 2 days after the subject adopted Ranger. Store employees confirm he spent over $300 on premium food, toys, and medical supplies. His behavior was described as caring, even obsessive about the dog's welfare. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This didn't match the narrative of a sadistic abuser that had fueled weeks of outrage. Williams continued. 3 days later, the same subject was observed at Miller's Hardware purchasing items, consistent with makeshift restraints and medical equipment. The timeline suggests something significant changed in the span of 72 hours. "What kind of change?" shouted someone from the back. "We believe the subject may be suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder related to military service," Williams replied carefully, "possibly triggered by anniversary dates or specific environmental factors." The gymnasium erupted. Veterans began shouting over civilian voices. Families of abuse victims demanded justice regardless of mental health issues, and animal rights activists called for maximum prosecution. Through it all, Ranger remained motionless, his training keeping him steady even as chaos swirled around him. Sarah stood and approached the microphone, and gradually the room quieted. Her reputation as David's mother, combined with her role in Ranger's rescue, gave her a moral authority that transcended the factional divisions. "I've spent 3 weeks caring for this dog," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I've watched him wake up screaming from nightmares. I've seen him flinch when shadows move too quickly. I've held him during panic attacks that lasted hours, and I want the person who did this to face consequences." The crowd murmured approval, but Sarah wasn't finished. "But I've also learned something else. This dog isn't just traumatized by abuse. He's grieving. He's mourning his handler, his purpose, his entire identity. What if his abuser is grieving too? What if we're dealing with 2 victims of the same war, trapped in a cycle neither one understands?" The silence that followed was deafening. Bob Hayes, the Korean War veteran who had opposed the initial rescue efforts, stood slowly from his seat in the front row. "Are you seriously suggesting we should feel sorry for the bastard who tortured a war hero?" His voice shook with rage. "I've got PTSD too, young lady. We all do. That doesn't give us license to torture innocent animals." "You're right," Sarah replied. "It doesn't. But punishment without understanding doesn't heal anyone. It just perpetuates the cycle." The debate that followed was unlike anything Millfield had ever witnessed. Vietnam veterans spoke of coming home to protests and silence, of trauma that went unrecognized for decades. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans described different but equally devastating challenges: multiple deployments, loss of unit cohesion, civilian populations that supported them in theory but couldn't understand their experiences. Dr. Margaret Sandford, a psychiatrist from Denver who specialized in military trauma, had been invited to provide expert testimony. She took the microphone with obvious reluctance. "What you're describing," she said, addressing the crowd, "sounds consistent with moral injury, trauma that occurs when someone is forced to act against their deepest moral beliefs, or when they witness betrayals of what is right. It's different from PTSD and often more devastating because it attacks the victim's core sense of identity." She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "If this individual formed a bond with this dog, then systematically abused him, he may be trapped in a self-destructive cycle where he's punishing himself by hurting what he loves most. It's not uncommon among veterans who feel they failed their brothers in arms." Emily, who had been silent throughout the meeting, suddenly stood up. Her small voice somehow carried through the large space as she approached the microphone with 8-year-old determination. "Ranger dreams about his soldier friend," she announced to the stunned audience. "He sees him getting hurt, and he couldn't help. The mean man dreams about soldiers too. That's why he hurt Ranger, because Ranger reminds him of the friends he couldn't save." The gymnasium fell completely silent. Tom Thompson started to retrieve his daughter, but Sarah gently stopped him. Emily's insight had cut through hours of heated debate with the clarity that only children sometimes possess. "How do you know this, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. Emily looked up at her with those serious green eyes. "Because I dream about my daddy too, the one who died in the war. And sometimes when I'm sad about him, I get angry at other people even when they didn't do anything wrong." Dr. Sanford stared at the child in amazement. That's actually a textbook description of displaced grief response. How old did you say she was?" The meeting continued for another hour, but the tone had fundamentally shifted. Instead of demands for vengeance, people began asking different questions. How many veterans in their community were struggling in silence? What resources existed for those dealing with moral injury and survivor's guilt? How could they prevent future tragedies while still ensuring justice for past ones? As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the back exit. Something about his posture, military straight despite obvious exhaustion, made her heart race. When he turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of his profile. Mid-30s, weathered face, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had carried heavy responsibilities in dangerous places. Their eyes met across the gymnasium for just a moment. His expression was a mixture of anguish, shame, and something that looked almost like relief. Then he turned and disappeared into the snowy night before Sarah could react. But in that brief exchange, she had seen something that confirmed Emily's extraordinary insight. The man they had been hunting wasn't hiding from justice. He was wrestling with his own demons, watching from a distance as his actions set in motion consequences he never intended. As Sarah loaded Ranger into her car for the drive home, she realized the climax of their story was approaching faster than anyone expected. The question was no longer whether they would find Marcus Thompson, but whether anyone would survive the confrontation when his carefully constructed isolation finally crumbled. Ranger seemed to sense her unease. For the first time since his rescue, he moved closer to her on the car seat, his warm weight a solid comfort against her shoulder. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, the broken nurse, the traumatized dog, and the little girl who somehow understood them both better than they understood themselves. New Year's Eve arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to seep through the walls of Sarah's house and settle in her bones. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees, and the wind howled through the pine trees with a sound that reminded her uncomfortably of the night she'd found Ranger. She had planned a quiet evening at home with him and Emily, who was staying overnight while her parents attended a friend's party in Denver. The first sign of trouble came at 9 p.m. when Ranger began pacing restlessly through the house. His behavior had been steadily improving over the past 2 weeks, but tonight something had him agitated in ways Sarah hadn't seen since his early days of recovery. He moved from window to window, ears alert, occasionally releasing low whines that raised the hair on her arms. "What's wrong, boy?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him as he stared intently at the front window. Outside, snow continued to fall in the orange glow of the streetlight, but she saw nothing unusual. Emily looked up from her coloring book, crayon poised in midair. "He smells the sad man," she said matter-of-factly. Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the sound of fireworks erupted from the town center as midnight approached in other time zones. The effect on Ranger was instantaneous and devastating. He dropped to his belly, panting heavily, his eyes wide with terror as the distant pops and booms triggered memories of combat that no amount of therapy had yet healed. "It's okay," Sarah soothed, sitting on the floor beside him. "It's just fireworks. You're safe." But her words seemed to have no effect. Ranger's condition rapidly deteriorated from anxiety to full panic attack. He began clawing at the hardwood floor, trying to dig himself into some imagined foxhole, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Sarah recognized the signs of severe PTSD episode. She'd seen similar reactions in human patients. Emily abandoned her coloring and crawled over to them, her small hands somehow knowing exactly where to touch Ranger's trembling flank to provide comfort. "The sad man is coming," she whispered. "He's scared of the loud sounds, too." As if summoned by her words, a knock came at the front door. Not the polite knock of a neighbor or friend, but the desperate, urgent hammering of someone in crisis. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized Emily had been right. Somehow the child had sensed Marcus Thompson's approach. "Stay with Ranger," Sarah instructed Emily, grabbing her phone to call 911 as she approached the door. "Please," came a voice from outside, rough with emotion and barely recognizable as human. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I need to see him. I need to make it right." Sarah's finger hovered over the call button. Through the peephole, she could see a tall man in military fatigues, his hands visible and empty, his face gaunt with exhaustion and something that looked like soul-deep despair. This wasn't the monster she'd imagined during weeks of investigation. This was a broken human being standing in her doorway on the coldest night of the year. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" she called through the door. "That's not my real name," he replied, his voice cracking. "My name is Jake Miller, Sergeant Jake Miller, 75th Ranger Regiment, and God help me, I hurt him. I hurt Hero." Hero. Sarah's heart clenched as she realized he was using Ranger's original military designation. The database had shown that name in the records. Hero, K9 Unit 5-1 Handler KIA Afghanistan 2018. "Jake," she said carefully, "I'm going to open this door, but I need you to understand something. That dog in there has been through hell because of what you did to him. If you make one move that I interpret as threatening—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know what I did. I know what I am. I just need to see him one more time before I fix this permanently." The implications of his words sent ice through Sarah's veins. She looked back at Emily, who was calmly stroking Ranger's head while he continued to shake with each distant firework. The child's eyes met hers with a gravity that seemed far beyond her 8 years. "He won't hurt Ranger," Emily said softly. "He's here to say goodbye." Against every instinct screaming at her to keep the door locked, Sarah slowly turned the deadbolt. Jake Miller stood on her porch looking like he'd aged a decade in the month since Ranger's rescue. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stopped sleeping weeks ago. "Thank you," he whispered, stepping inside when Sarah gestured him forward. The moment Jake entered the living room, Ranger's reaction was unlike anything Sarah had witnessed. Instead of cowering or showing aggression, the dog went completely still. The panic attack stopped abruptly, replaced by an alertness that seemed to encompass his entire being. Slowly, deliberately, Ranger rose to his feet and approached Jake with the measured gait of a soldier reporting for duty. Jake dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face as Ranger stopped just out of arm's reach. The dog's posture wasn't submissive or fearful. It was expectant, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since the night he was thrown away. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice breaking completely. "God, hero, I'm so sorry. You deserved better. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." Emily moved closer, positioning herself between the two broken warriors with the instinctive wisdom of a child who understood trauma in ways adults often couldn't. "Tell him about the friends you couldn't save," she said to Jake. "He needs to understand it wasn't about him." Jake's face crumpled with fresh grief. "His handler was my best friend," he said, speaking to Ranger but loud enough for Sarah and Emily to hear. "Staff Sergeant Michael Chen. We served 3 tours together. When he got Hero, we became a team, the 3 of us. Mike used to say Hero was the best soldier in the unit because he never doubted, never hesitated, never left anyone behind." Ranger's ears pricked forward at familiar names, and Sarah realized this was the first time since his rescue that he'd shown recognition of his military service. Jake continued, his words coming in torrents as if a dam had finally burst. "The day Mike died, we were on patrol. IED took out our lead vehicle. Mike was trapped, and Hero tried to get to him, but I held him back. I made a command decision. I chose to save the dog instead of the man." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of celebrations from town and the soft whistle of wind through the eaves. "Hero lived with me after that," Jake went on. "For 2 years he was the only thing that kept me going. But every time I looked at him, I saw Mike. I saw the choice I made. I saw the friend I let die. And the guilt. It started eating me alive." Sarah began to understand the psychological maze that had led to the systematic abuse. Jake hadn't tortured Ranger out of cruelty. He'd been trying to punish himself through the dog who represented his greatest failure and his deepest love. "When the anniversary of Mike's death came around last month," Jake continued, "something snapped. I started seeing Hero as the reason Mike was dead. If I hadn't chosen to save the dog, maybe I could have saved the man. So I tried to make Hero suffer the way Mike suffered. The way I was suffering." Emily moved closer to Jake, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. "But that's not how it works," she said with 8-year-old certainty. "Hurting someone you love doesn't bring back the people who died. It just makes more people hurt." The truth of her words seemed to hit Jake with physical force. He doubled over as if struck, great sobs racking his frame as the full weight of what he'd done finally crashed down on him. And then something miraculous happened. Ranger, the dog who had flinched from human touch for weeks, stepped forward and gently placed his massive head against Jake's shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. One soldier acknowledging another's pain, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. The moment of connection between Jake and Ranger shattered when the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Sarah realized with growing horror that someone, probably a neighbor concerned about the stranger at her door, had called the police. Jake's head snapped up at the familiar sound, his military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation with practiced efficiency. "They're coming for me," he said, his voice suddenly flat and emotionless. The broken man who had been sobbing moments before was replaced by a soldier preparing for his final mission. Sarah moved toward the window and saw 3 police cruisers racing down her street, their red and blue lights painting the snow-covered neighborhood in harsh, strobing colors. Detective Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle, his hand resting on his service weapon as he approached the house with backup officers flanking him. "Jake, listen to me," Sarah said urgently. "You need to surrender peacefully. Whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever you meant about fixing this permanently, it won't help anyone." But Jake was already reaching into his jacket, and Sarah's heart stopped as she saw the glint of metal. Emily, with the fearless intuition that had guided her throughout this ordeal, stepped directly between Jake and the approaching officers. "Don't hurt yourself," she said simply. "Ranger needs you to be brave the right way." Jake's hand froze. In his grip was indeed a weapon, but not what Sarah had expected. It was a Purple Heart medal, worn and tarnished with a small photograph tucked behind it. The photo showed a young soldier in desert camouflage kneeling beside a magnificent German shepherd, both of them squinting against the Afghan sun. "This belonged to Mike," Jake said, his voice hollow. "I've carried it since the day he died, planning to join him when I couldn't take the guilt anymore." Detective Williams' voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "Jake Miller, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible. Nobody has to get hurt tonight." "But I did get hurt," Jake whispered, more to himself than to Sarah or Emily. "We all got hurt, and I made it worse by hurting the one thing Mike loved most." Ranger, who had been watching this exchange with the intense focus he'd once brought to combat situations, suddenly moved. He walked to Jake's side and sat in perfect military formation. Back straight, eyes forward, every inch the professional soldier he'd been trained to be. Then, in a gesture that took Sarah's breath away, he lifted his right paw and placed it on Jake's knee. "He's not asking you to die," Emily said quietly. "He's asking you to live." For both of them. The weight of that simple truth seemed to break something inside Jake. He doubled over again, clutching the Purple Heart to his chest as years of suppressed grief finally found its voice. But this time, instead of the destructive rage that had driven him to abuse Ranger, it was clean sorrow, the kind of pain that cleanses rather than corrupts. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, her hands raised where the officers could see them. "Detective Williams," she called out. "He's not armed and he's not dangerous, but he is suicidal. We need mental health professionals here, not more weapons." Williams lowered his megaphone, his expression conflicted. "Sarah, this man systematically tortured a war hero. The community wants justice." "The community wants answers," Sarah corrected. "And healing." "You won't get either if Jake Miller dies tonight." Through the open door she could hear Emily's voice, calm and steady as she continued talking to Jake. The child seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of trauma that surpassed trained professionals. She was telling him about her own father, the soldier she'd never really known, and how his death had left a hole in her heart that no amount of anger could fill. "But I found out something important," Emily was saying. "The hole doesn't go away, but it can grow flowers if you let it. My daddy died saving people, just like your friend Mike did. If you die too, who's going to remember them? Who's going to tell their stories?" Dr. Margaret Sanford arrived 20 minutes later, having been called from her New Year's Eve party in Denver. She entered Sarah's house with the careful deliberation of someone who had talked dozens of veterans back from similar ledges. But she stopped short when she saw the tableau in the living room. Jake Miller sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, Ranger pressed against his side, and Emily Rose Thompson holding both the Purple Heart and Jake's hand while she explained the difference between being brave and being dead. "In all my years of practice," Dr. Sanford murmured to Sarah, "I've never seen anything like this." The breakthrough came near dawn, as the first pale light of New Year's Day filtered through the windows. Jake had been talking for hours about Mike Chen, about the choices that haunted him, about the months of escalating abuse that had culminated in abandoning Ranger in that frozen dumpster. But he'd also been listening, really listening, to Emily's 8-year-old wisdom and Ranger's silent forgiveness. "I thought if I could make Hero hate me the way I hated myself, it would be easier," Jake said, his voice hoarse from crying and confession. "If he turned vicious, if he became dangerous, then putting him down would be mercy instead of murder. I was trying to destroy the evidence of my failure." "But he didn't turn vicious," Sarah observed. "Even after everything you did to him, he still recognized you as Pac. He still trusted you enough to approach you tonight." Jake looked down at Ranger, who had maintained his vigil throughout the long night. "Dogs are better than people," he said simply. "They love without conditions, forgive without question. I didn't deserve that kind of grace, but he gave it anyway." Dr. Sanford stepped forward, her professional assessment complete. "Jake, what you've described is textbook moral injury complicated by survivor's guilt and PTSD. The good news is that all of these conditions are treatable. The bad news is that you're going to have to do the hardest thing a soldier can do. You're going to have to surrender." "To the police?" Jake asked. "To the process of healing," she corrected. "To therapy, to medication if necessary, to facing what happened in Afghanistan without trying to punish yourself or anyone else. It's not a battle you can win alone." As the sun rose on New Year's Day, Jake Miller made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He stood up slowly, Ranger rising with him, and walked toward the front door where Detective Williams waited with handcuffs and an arrest warrant. But before he reached the threshold, he turned back to Emily, who was watching with the same serious expression she brought to everything. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me the difference between being brave and being dead." Emily nodded solemnly. "Will you take care of yourself now, for Mike and for Ranger and for all the other soldiers who can't take care of themselves anymore?" "I'll try," Jake promised. "That's all I can do. Try." As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Jake Miller looked back one last time at the dog he'd tortured and the child who'd saved them both. Ranger stood at attention in the doorway, his brown eyes holding no trace of fear or resentment. Only the patient loyalty that had made him a hero at ground zero and would, Sarah realized, make him a healer in whatever came next. The arrest that should have felt like victory instead felt like the beginning of a longer, more complicated journey toward something that might eventually resemble justice. But for the first time since Christmas Eve, Sarah felt hope that the journey would be worth taking. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Sarah found herself standing in the same alley behind Miller's Hardware where she'd first discovered Ranger. But tonight the space had been transformed into something beautiful. Twinkling lights strung between the buildings, a small stage decorated with red and gold bunting, and folding chairs arranged in neat rows for the community's first annual Veterans Mental Health Awareness event. The irony wasn't lost on her. The place where a war hero had nearly died from neglect and abuse had become a beacon of hope for other veterans struggling with invisible wounds. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most broken places held the greatest potential for healing. Ranger sat beside her, his coat gleaming in the Christmas lights, wearing a new service vest that identified him not as a military working dog, but as a certified therapy animal. The transformation from the skeletal creature she'd pulled from a dumpster to this dignified, purposeful dog still took her breath away. His physical scars had faded, but more importantly, his eyes had regained the intelligent alertness that had made him a hero at ground zero. "Are you ready for this, boy?" Sarah asked, scratching behind his ears. Ranger's tail wagged once, a measured response that she'd learned meant he was focused and prepared for work. Over the past year, They'd developed their own language of subtle communications, built on trust that had been painstakingly reconstructed one day at a time. Emily Rose Thompson approached from across the alley, no longer the silent, withdrawn child she'd been a year ago. At 9, she was still serious beyond her years, but therapy and her unique bond with Ranger had helped her find her voice in ways that amazed her adoptive parents and teachers. She wore a red dress for the occasion and carried a folder containing what she called her important papers. "Is Jake coming tonight?" Emily asked, settling beside Ranger with the easy familiarity of long friendship. "He'll be here," Sarah confirmed. "Dr. Sanford thinks he's ready." The past year had been a journey none of them could have anticipated. Jake Miller's case had divided the community initially, some demanding maximum punishment for animal abuse, others advocating for treatment over incarceration. The compromise had been unusual but effective. A guilty plea to animal cruelty charges in exchange for participation in an experimental program combining incarceration, intensive therapy, and community service. Jake had spent 6 months in the county jail, followed by 6 months in a halfway house specifically designed for veterans dealing with PTSD and moral injury. Throughout his treatment, he'd worked with Dr. Sanford to understand the psychological mechanisms that had led him to abuse the dog he loved. More importantly, he'd learned to forgive himself for the choices he'd made in Afghanistan, the impossible decision to save Ranger instead of attempting to rescue Mike Chen. The evening's program was Jake's idea, born from his own experience and designed to prevent other veterans from falling into the same destructive spiral. He'd spent months organizing support groups, crisis intervention training, and awareness campaigns. Tonight's event would officially launch the Michael Chen Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting veterans and their service animals. As the crowd gathered, Sarah noticed the diversity of attendees. Veterans from every era, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, sat alongside their families and community members. Dr. Crawford was there with several other veterinarians who'd volunteered to provide free care for veteran service animals. Detective Williams had brought his teenage son, eager to show him positive examples of law enforcement engagement with the community. Mayor Patricia Hendricks took the stage as the evening's host, but she immediately called Emily forward to open the program. The child approached the microphone with the same serious determination she brought to everything, Ranger padding silently beside her. "A year ago, I couldn't talk to most people," Emily began, her voice clear and strong. "I was sad about my daddy who died in the war, and I didn't know how to tell anyone about the hurting inside me. But then I met Ranger and he was hurt inside too, and somehow we understood each other." She paused, looking out at the audience with mature eyes. "Tonight is about understanding each other. It's about remembering that sometimes the people who look the strongest are actually the most hurt, and sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to help someone else heal too." Emily's words set the tone for everything that followed. Dr. Sanford spoke about moral injury and the differences between PTSD and survivor's guilt. Several veterans shared their own stories of struggle and recovery, emphasizing that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. Then Jake Miller stepped onto the stage. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the hollow-eyed, desperate man who'd appeared at Sarah's door on New Year's Eve. Jake had gained back the weight he'd lost. His posture reflected someone who'd reclaimed his sense of purpose, and his eyes held the clarity of someone who'd done the hard work of confronting his demons. 14 months ago, I made a series of choices that nearly destroyed the most important relationship in my life," Jake began. "I hurt someone who trusted me completely, someone who deserved my protection. I did it because I was drowning in guilt and shame, and I thought if I could make Ranger, hero, hate me as much as I hated myself, it would somehow balance the scales." He paused, his eyes finding Ranger in the front row. The dog's ears were forward, alert but calm, as if he were listening to every word. What I learned through therapy, through the support of this community, and through the incredible forgiveness of a dog who should have never trusted another human being, is that trauma doesn't have to define us. The choices we make in our darkest moments don't have to be our final chapters. Jake went on to announce the Foundation's first initiatives: a crisis hotline staffed by trained veterans, emergency funding for service animal medical care, and a peer support program that would pair struggling veterans with others who'd successfully navigated similar challenges. Mike Chen died serving his country, Jake concluded, but his legacy isn't his death. It's the lives he saved, the example he set, and the reminder that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. The Michael Chen Memorial Foundation exists to make sure that legacy lives on. As Jake left the stage, something unexpected happened. Ranger stood and walked to him, sitting in perfect formation at his side, not as a service dog returning to his handler, but as one soldier honoring another. The gesture brought tears to eyes throughout the audience, a visible symbol of forgiveness and healing that transcended human understanding. The evening concluded with the lighting of a memorial tree, a towering pine decorated with ornaments bearing the names of fallen service members and their working dogs. As each light flickered on, family members and fellow veterans shared brief stories of those being honored. When Mike Chen's name was illuminated, Jake stepped forward with Ranger beside him. "Staff Sergeant Michael Chen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cold night air. "Handler, friend, hero. He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to serve others despite that fear. His memory will guide this foundation and everyone it serves." Ranger lifted his head and released a single, mournful howl, the traditional military farewell that echoed off the buildings and seemed to carry upward toward the stars. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by the unlikely family that had formed around tragedy and healing. Emily was showing Jake her latest drawings, pictures of soldiers and dogs working together, their faces no longer shadowed by sadness, but bright with purpose. Tom and Lisa Thompson were discussing volunteer opportunities with Dr. Sandford, while their daughter explained to anyone who would listen that broken things can fix other broken things if they're brave enough to try. Dr. Crawford approached with an elderly man Sarah didn't recognize, a Korean War veteran whose own service dog had recently died. "Jake," Dr. Crawford said, "I'd like you to meet Robert Hayes. He's been following your story, and he's interested in discussing the Foundation's next steps." Sarah smiled, remembering Bob Hayes as the veteran who'd initially opposed spending resources on Ranger's rescue. Now he was shaking Jake's hand and talking about expanding the program statewide. As the last of the guests departed and the lights were turned off, Sarah found herself alone with Ranger in the alley where their journey had begun. Snow was beginning to fall, gentle flakes that caught the light from the street lamps and transformed the urban space into something almost magical. "Look how far we've come, boy," she whispered, kneeling to wrap her arms around Ranger's neck. "All of us." Ranger leaned into her embrace, his tail wagging slowly as he watched Jake Miller walk toward them through the falling snow. The three of them, the nurse who'd lost her son, the dog who'd survived betrayal, and the soldier who'd found redemption, stood together in the place where healing had begun. Above them, the memorial tree continued to glow, its lights visible from blocks away, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed reminders that even the most broken things could be made whole again. Sometimes the most profound healing happens in the most unexpected places. A year ago, Sarah Mitchell was a grieving mother carrying the weight of her son's sacrifice in Afghanistan. Ranger was a broken war hero, discarded and dying. Jake Miller was a veteran drowning in survivor's guilt, destroying what he loved most because he couldn't forgive himself. Emily was a silent child trapped by autism and grief she couldn't express. Today, they stand together as living proof that broken doesn't mean worthless. It means ready to be remade into something stronger. Sarah has found purpose beyond her pain, channeling her loss into healing others. Ranger, once America's four-legged hero at Ground Zero, has become a therapy dog helping veterans reclaim their lives. Jake discovered that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing a different future. And Emily learned that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. The Michael Chen Memorial Foundation now serves over 200 veterans across Colorado, providing crisis intervention, service animal support, and peer counseling. What began as a Christmas Eve rescue has become a movement, reminding us that in America, we don't leave anyone behind. Not our two-legged heroes, not our four-legged ones, and not the walking wounded who carry invisible scars. Their story echoes the truth we sometimes forget in our later years. It's never too late for a second chance, never too late to transform pain into purpose, never too late to find family in the most unexpected places. Sarah, Ranger, Jake, and Emily prove that healing isn't just possible. It's what happens when broken people choose to love each other back to wholeness. As Emily says in her wisdom beyond her years, sometimes broken things save other broken things. In a world that often feels divided and dark, their story reminds us that hope springs eternal, love conquers all, and the best chapters of our lives might still be unwritten. 3 years have passed since that frozen Christmas Eve, and the ripple effects continue to spread. Sarah has returned to school to become a licensed therapist specializing in military families. She and Ranger work together now, officially certified as a therapy team that visits VA hospitals across the region. Her empty house has become a haven for foster animals and a meeting place for support groups, filled once again with purpose and laughter. Jake Miller completed his rehabilitation program with honors and now serves as the Foundation's executive director. He's remarried, a fellow veteran named Maria who understands the unique challenges of military trauma, and they're expecting their first child. The baby will grow up knowing Uncle Ranger and Aunt Emily, surrounded by a chosen family built on forgiveness and second chances. Emily, now 11, has become something of a local celebrity for her insights into animal therapy and childhood trauma. She speaks at conferences with the same serious determination she brought to Healing Ranger, advocating for programs that pair special needs children with therapy animals. Her autism, once seen as a limitation, has become a gift that allows her to connect with wounded souls in ways neurotypical people often cannot. The Foundation has expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The Michael Chen Memorial Foundation now operates in 12 states, with programs ranging from service dog placement to crisis intervention. They've prevented dozens of veteran suicides, facilitated hundreds of therapy animal partnerships, and created a network of peer support that spans the country. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation is the simplest one. Ranger, approaching his 10th birthday, moves with the confidence of a dog who knows his worth. His therapy work has helped over 50 veterans reconnect with life, hope, and healing. Children light up when they see him, veterans relax in his presence, and his gentle wisdom seems to communicate directly with wounded hearts. On this Christmas Eve, 3 years to the day since Sarah found him dying in that dumpster, Ranger is exactly where he belongs, surrounded by family, serving others, living proof that heroism isn't about the battles you win, but about the love you give and the lives you touch. The alley behind Miller's Hardware has been permanently transformed into Memorial Park, with a statue of a German shepherd and soldier standing watch over a garden where families come to remember their fallen heroes. A plaque at the base reads, In memory of all who served and in honor of all who heal, may we never forget that the strongest among us are often the most wounded, and the greatest victories are won not in war, but in the choice to love despite our pain. As snow begins to fall on another Christmas Eve, 4 figures can be seen walking through the park together: a woman, a man, a child, and a dog, their footprints creating a path that others will follow toward healing, hope, and home. Their story reminds us that in America, the land of second chances, redemption is always possible, families come in all forms, and heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes broken things do save other broken things. Sometimes the endings we fear most become the beginnings we needed all along. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we discover that love truly is the only force powerful enough to heal a nation, one heart at a time. A message for our community. Dear friends, this story of Ranger, Sarah, Jake, and Emily speaks to something deep in the American spirit: our belief in redemption, second chances, and the healing power of unconditional love. As many of us navigate our golden years, we understand that life's greatest battles aren't always won on foreign soil, but in our own hearts, as we learn to forgive, to heal, and to find purpose in our pain. Whether you've served in uniform, raised military children, or simply witnessed the quiet heroism of everyday life, this story reminds us that it's never too late to write a new chapter, never too late to extend grace to the wounded, and never too late to discover that our greatest victories come not from what we've achieved, but from whom we've loved back to life. Let's connect in the comments. Have you or someone you love ever found healing through an unexpected relationship? Perhaps with a beloved pet, a chance encounter, or an act of service to others? What small act of compassion in your community could create ripple effects of healing like Sarah's Christmas Eve rescue? Please share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.